Hi, I'm Joel Richardson. This is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, we are blessed once again to be joined by my good friend Samuel Whitfield. Samuel, welcome back to The Underground.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
All right. And so last time Samuel was on, we talked a bit about the simple fact that the Lord is redirecting the attention of the world, of the church, back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, back to the Middle East, back to the Jew and the Muslim. He is grabbing the newspaper headlines all across the world with these things. And if we are people of discernment, if we are a prophetic people, then we are wrestling through this. We're saying, Lord, what are you doing in all of this? And how are we to respond? So I want to just sort of pick up on some of those themes. As I've said, and if you haven't been with us before, just say, Samuel, as I said, is one of the sharpest thinkers out there and one of the sharper guys that I know with regard to the issue of the Middle East, of Israel, of Islam, wrestling through a lot of the theological and just geopolitical realities and how all of these things relate to us as followers of Jesus. So in this week's episode, I want to jump back in and sort of just even pick up our conversation where we left off. Now, we were talking about, again, the Lord is bringing the attention of the church back to the Middle East. This is obvious, for anyone who has discernment. We want to be paying attention. But I want to shift a little bit more to the sort of theological side of things. Now, you and I have talked quite a few times, and we've said our focus, because essentially what happens is in the church, you get a lot of people and they become pro-Israel. And that's sort of just a general catchphrase. I'm pro-Israel. Now, I would say I am pro-Israel. I'm for Israel, certainly. But what we're saying is the call of Christians is not first and foremost primarily just to be political cheerleaders for the state of Israel, although I am a supporter of Israel, and that's important. But our first and foremost priority as believers is to have a gospel-centered lens with regard to Israel. Not just Israel, of course, but Israel and Islam, Israel and the Islamic world. But just sort of tease that out a little bit. What does that mean to you? Or what are just some of the things that it means to you to have more of a gospel-centered focus, more of a gospel-centered lens than a purely political lens?
Yeah. Here's how I'd kind of break it down. I'd say one is we have to understand the historical context, of the last 100 years, which is 100 years or so, which is most Americans have been what we would call pro-Israel, supportive of Israel, which is obviously a great thing. It's exactly what we want to see. But there's been a deficiency in it, which is due to the there have been some positives from dispensationalism. In other words, treat the prophets seriously, Israel matters, but there have been some real negatives from dispensationalism. And one of them from early classical revised dispensationalism, of course, was there's kind of two things going on. God's going to help Israel, he's going to help this Gentile church, and those things are kind of separate. So love Israel because God's got a purpose and a plan, but it didn't really energize, wait a minute, but they need the gospel preached to them. They actually need the Gentile church to speak to them, to call them to repentance. So with that historical setting, that kind of sets a context where, as you mentioned, the do you support Israel question, well, if you're asking us politically, well, of course we would support Israel and love Israel. But now if you're asking me as more than an American or an individual, as a Christian, as a believer, a follower of Jesus, how do I support Israel? Well, now I have to put on a gospel-centered lens. And by that I would mean this. We can support Israel politically, affirm her, want to see her prosper, But as followers of Jesus, we know that Israel will never fully prosper or fully come into her inheritance without loving and following and being reconciled to Jesus. In other words, the same way we would for any other nation. So to be gospel-centered, to my mind, is the ultimate prosperity, success, and destiny of a people is connected to whether they are right with Jesus, regardless of the nation they're in. But it's specifically an issue with Israel because we've got some decades of history where supporting Israel, the gospel was barely a conversation. You know, as you know, one of the largest Christian Western organizations energizing Christians to support Israel intentionally never makes this part of the conversation. And I don't think we have to be offensive. It doesn't mean every conversation, you know, with a Jewish man or woman is, you need to accept Jesus now or else. And it doesn't mean that we never defend them, stand with them, support them, you know, until they accept Jesus. But it does mean that according to the terms of the Bible and the gospel, that we are faithful to not only support them as a people, but give a witness. You're actually never going to come into the fullness of your destiny apart from Jesus. And that way you're the same as every other human on the planet. God's consistent on that issue that no one's right without his son, with him.
Exactly. And of course, this applies to everyone in the earth.
Right.
So really, it's an issue really of getting our priorities straight. Because it's not as though supporting Israel politically is not important. It is important. It's just that proclaiming their Messiah to Israel is far more important. It takes for a Christian, it absolutely takes precedent over the issue of supporting them politically. Because I think a lot of Christians, they simply think, well, they look at Genesis, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. And so our job is just to bless them. Well, we're not blessing them if we're not sharing the gospel with them ultimately. I'll just share a little story. I don't tell this story a lot, but I've told it before, and I'll tell it a lot. And it's a story which actually formed who I am pretty deeply. But just before I got saved, sort of in the leading up until where I came to faith, I had a real close friend who actually lived with me, my mother, my divorced mother, lived with us for a couple of years. And so he was sort of like, he was my best friend, closest thing to a brother. But then, once you live with someone, then you're like a brother, which means you fight, but you're, kind of
but
thing.
You still like each other.
Yeah. So, here was a guy in my life who had been in my life for, quite a few years during my teenage years. And, as we got older, I got saved at 19. So as we got older, he was a cokehead, he was a crackhead, he was involved in a lot of drugs, as was I. I was not a crackhead, but I was involved in all that very heavily. And but I was always kind of giving him a hard time because I won't get into all the details, but theft and just doing things where he was nearly getting killed or killing people, and just things that were, even for a drug addict, it was like, that's really crossing the line. And because we were so close, I would always sort of get on his case, if you will. And he was also kind of the life of the party. And so he always wanted to be where he was. Well, because I was always getting on his case, he would avoid me often on the weekends, right? Which that would hurt me when you're an 18-year-old kid. That's all you want to do is be where the party is at. And here's a guy that I really like who's avoiding me all the time. And in the natural, I thought that he basically hated me. Just that simple. Well, just before I got saved, he got killed in a car wreck, drinking and driving. It was somewhat inevitable. But I was with his dad. It was about a week after he died, and I had found his truck had rolled a few times, so I found a bunch of his stuff in the street. His father had been a vet, and he just had this American flag sticker that his dad had given him that was in there. I brought it, to him, and his father said to me, he said, just before he died, I'm just going to call him Zeke. That's not his real name. He said, just before he died, he told me, he said, that you're his only real friend in the world. Now, if you were to know Zeke, he had a million friends. He avoided me, and here I was not a believer yet, but something clicked. And because in the natural, it said, he can't stand me, he avoids me, he's mad at me all the time. And yet he just told his dad that I'm the only person in the world that actually cares about him and actually loves him. And I made a vow, and sometimes vows are bad if you make a vow. But I made a vow and I said, Lord, for the rest of my life, I'm never going to be the kind of person that shuts my mouth, that refuses to speak the truth because I don't want to lose relationship. Now, I know this is kind of a personal story, but I think a lot of the church functions this way. They say, we want to be friends with the Jews, because the Jews are going to make it very clear. Don't you dare preach the gospel to us. Don't you dare tell me I need Jesus. If you're my friend, if you're sensitive after the Holocaust, then don't you dare come and tell me that without Jesus, I'm destined to a lake of fire. Any of these things. Don't you dare be so insensitive. And it can get you, when you're trying to empathize, when you're really trying to go there with the Jewish people. But the fact of the matter is that if we love them, if we actually love them, we need to get in their face and say, you're killing yourself, by not following the God of Israel, by not being obedient to the God of Israel, who I as a Gentile worship. You are preparing yourself for an eternity separated from God in the lake of fire. That's not always going to ingratiate you to the Jewish people. It's not always going to ingratiate you to the state of Israel. But as a church, we need to be people who resolve in our hearts to say, if I love somebody, I'm willing to say the things that will make them actually hate me,
right?
Or at least seem like they hate me. And so this is a big challenge, because you get a lot of people that have a huge heart for Israel, but there's that offense, there's that stumbling stone, Jesus. We talked last time you were here about how the Lord is setting it up to where Jerusalem is like this magnet of controversy. But even more so than just Jerusalem, if you're to peel that onion back, what is at the center of the controversy? It's Jesus. It's the gospel. And that's really what it all boils down to. Why is the whole world in a controversy over Jerusalem? Because of this man. Why is the whole Islamic world in an uproar? It's because of this man named Jesus.
Right. It's just like you said. I like to sometimes say it this way. To support Israel politically, which we should do, but never deliver the gospel, is irresponsible. Because in other words, we're saying, you're awesome, we're for you, but we're never actually giving you the means to come into your inheritance. It's something we would never do anywhere else. It's like, let's support Portugal, but don't ever preach the gospel. It's like, what? Like, we would never do that. And all the more when you have Israel in a pressurized situation, faced with Islamic terror, faced with Hamas, faced with what they're faced with. We want to be a voice against those things. We want to be a voice supportive of them, but then we also have to be a voice that goes, hey, your Bible says anytime you're under pressure, your God's trying to talk to you. So I'm going to give you the witness of what your God's asking of you, because he's trying to use these factors to get your attention. This trouble is used for his attention. And I think even like you mentioned, in the Christian community, there's theologians that are dug in on either side. We're dug in. The Bible clearly has a purpose for Israel. This 1948, 1967, everything now is not just some random accidental. We're dug in on that point. There's some theologians that have dug in, like you said. I love the way you say it. 80-70 matters. 1948 doesn't. Like it. But there's a lot of believers in the middle that I think are actually disconnected from Israel, because they look and they go, you're asking me to support a prime minister and a set of policies, but I'm a follower of Jesus, and it feels like you're kind of telling them that they're awesome and okay and God's for them, but don't they make mistakes too? And that seems inconsistent, and you won't talk about the Palestinians. And I think as followers of Jesus, we really need to go, no, look, supporting Israel politically, we live in a political world. And a political world is always, nothing's completely right. So supportive of Israel is not, therefore Israel's awesome, but in every way. But support of Israel also includes delivering, the gospel. It's not just we love them because they're awesome and we take a dispensational hands-off approach. No, we support them, but we deliver the gospel. And by the way, delivering the gospel to Israel doesn't mean we therefore don't love the Palestinian, the Arab, the Persian or Iranian, because when you go all political, you have to have friends and enemies. If I'm for Israel, I have to be against the Palestinian this or that. No, I can be for Israel in a political sense, but from a gospel-centered sense, being for Israel doesn't make me anti. I can reach out and go, no, God's got a calling for different people groups. We can contend for it, cheer for it, form relationship. You know, the Palestinian believer is part of our family in a way that the unsaved Jew is not yet.
Yeah.
And we can celebrate that. And so I think a lot of the church is actually waiting for us to go a gospel-centered approach to Israel, and they go, oh, okay, the replacement thing was attractive to me because I didn't see the gospel. Now that I see the gospel, okay, I'm willing to hear the Bible verses and engage with you.
For this week's episode, we are offering the new Coming Battle for Jerusalem teaching DVD set. This dynamic 3 DVD set features 6 teaching sessions addressing critical issues related to Israel and the last days. Unravel one of the most controversial passages in all of the Scriptures. What do the Scriptures really say about the coming restoration of the kingdom of Israel? What will the world be like when Jesus returns? Finally, we will unpack Jesus' final sermon known as the Olivet Discourse. Filmed live on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, experience the sermon from the very location where Jesus himself taught these things. To order my newest teaching DVD, go to joelstrumpet.com, go to the store, and click on the Coming Battle for Jerusalem teaching DVD. This DVD is the perfect companion to my latest book, When a Jew Rules the World. If you buy both together now, you get When a Jew Rules the World, retail priced at $25.95 for only $15. To get this special, go to joelstrumpet.com, click on the store, and click on the Coming Battle for Jerusalem special.
And you know, there's another aspect of this is, like you said, you've got these different theological camps, and folks are dug in. Yeah, absolutely, I'm dug in. God has a future for Israel. And then on the other side, let's say you've got folks that might go to the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, and they're the replacement theologians, and they're focused primarily on the issue of justice for the Palestinian. Now, the truth is, many of the criticisms that some of these guys might wage against those that are just pro-Israel, there are aspects of their criticisms that I actually agree with, which is to say, listen, this is not purely, as you just articulated, just about supporting a state in a blanket manner. I think there are aspects of Jewish politics that as Christians we need to give freedom to one another to have disagreements over. I mean, look at the present political situation here in the United States. Christians can't agree on, nearly anything, and this shouldn't be a primary issue of faith.
Right.
But there's this dimension that we have to add into the equation that all Christians need to agree on, which is that there is a clear demonic hatred which is inspired by Satan, it's empowered by Satan, and it is being fertilized and it's given full reign in many of the nations, not wholesale, but in many of the nations in a large way that surround Israel. And then that political reality, which is again demonically charged, rooted in the Scriptures, that is actually affecting things like the United Nations and the opinions, the political climate all over the world with regard to Israel. So Israel, from a political perspective, it's not just like any other nation. And that, well, how do you feel about the present situation in Gambia? That's not an issue that Christians should really have a huge, quarrel over. But for some reason, everyone's upset about Israel. But it's a factor that most of our replacement theologian brothers and sisters, I'll call them brothers and sisters because they are, I thoroughly disagree with them regarding Israel. I may agree with them that, listen, there are issues of injustices for the Palestinian Christians. There are issues that are not right. Now, that's not an indictment necessarily of Israel. It's an acknowledgement of the mess and the complexity of what we're dealing with over there. But in the midst of talking to our friends that go to Christ at the Checkpoint who are only focused on maybe some of it's the issue of justice for the Palestinians is a bit of a cover for their anti-Israel stance. That's quite possible too. But in this issue of justice, they also it seems as though they refuse to acknowledge the demonic, overwhelming, the tsunami of demonic rage that is sweeping the earth about Israel. And so we need to come and say, no, these are two factors from a biblical perspective that we can champion and say we're going to contend with Israel and stand with Israel, even though I might not agree with many political decisions. I have enough, I'm busy enough trying to figure out what I think about politics here in the United States. I don't have enough time to figure out exactly what I believe about settlements and all these various mundane issues. But in the midst of it, I have to acknowledge that there's a demonic war being waged against this people. And I have to be someone that stands for justice on behalf of all people, like you said.
Right, and I think you're bringing up a great point about the complexity of the issue. So, for example, there's various pro-Palestinian voices that are essentially bringing up a one-dimensional political issue, meaning, does Israel create a difficult dynamic for us? I think a lot of Israelis would go, yes, and we wish we could fix it. And they would go, yeah, there's some places that are maybe a little bit too much force or this or that because of this. And I think even as Christians in the West, we can go, you know what, for many decades, we tended to go, we love Israel, Jewish people are awesome, but not engage at all with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. So I accept that. But at the same time, we have to look at the complexity and go, as Palestinians, yes, you're in a difficult, tight situation. Israel is only one component. Let's talk about the threat of Islam. You and I both know, we talk to some brothers and sisters, and on one hand, Israel makes their life difficult because Israel's in an impossible situation, not just because it wants to, but they're also facing real threat and oppression and pressure from Islamic things, Islamic forces. And for example, you go to a crisis at the checkpoint. I did go to one of them because I think you got to be faithful to hear people out. And I'm going, we're not even talking about Islam. We're not talking about some of the actions of surrounding Arab nations. And when we do talk about Islam, we're presenting it almost as like a cultural thing rather than, as you would call it, rightly so, a demonic agenda. I think the life of Abraham, for me, helps shape how I relate to Israel, right? Abraham comes out and God goes, hey, I picked you. You're the guy. Okay, cool. So Abraham's awesome. People that bless you, meaning they agree with what I'm doing, through you are going to inherit some blessing as well. Then the guy goes around and starts lying about his wife. Well, she's my sister. And it's like, wait a minute. I thought you were yeah, you're called, but in your calling, you make mistakes. Israel's called. In her calling makes mistakes. And there's nothing wrong if we were in Abraham's tent going, hey, Abraham, quit lying about Sarah. But notice that even in that interchange, God tells the pagan king, hey, go have Abraham pray for you. In other words, hey, recognize there's a calling on him. It doesn't mean you can't go, hey, why'd you tell me your wife was your sister? That's sick. Don't do that. Yeah. But then he goes, but recognize there's some calling. Recognize there's demonic rage in the earth. It doesn't mean we can't ever go, hey, Israel, stop it. Why are you doing that? Yeah. But it means we go, hey, there is a calling, and we want to affirm it and not get so caught up in, criticizing that we ignore the demonic rage that's present, primarily in Islam, but as you pointed out, in other facets as well.
Spread all over the world, yeah. And it's easy. I mean, you and I are Americans, but it's easy for anyone in the, at ease in the coastlands, as the Bible would say, whether we're in Australia or Europe or the United States, it seems as though everyone has an opinion about Israel. This is one of the things I love so much about One King, is that it gives people an opportunity, because again, it is a messy situation. It is a complex situation. It is a multifaceted mess over there, yet we're called to engage it. So it's easy to have all these opinions, and I think I always say conservative men in particular always try to make things simple. We always want to have answers, and so you just look at comments online, and well, all these people are idiots. They should just do it this way, and everyone sort of has it. But the only way that we're going to confront, recognize the complexity of the situation over there is to actually go over and spend time. And this is one of the reasons I love One King so much, this yearly conference, conference intensive tour is because you actually get to meet with the people that live daily, that were raised in the midst of the complexities, who understand the complexities and have wrestled with Jesus in the midst of the complexities. These are the people that we really want to learn from.
Yeah, that is one of the primary reasons we've done this, the last 2 years now and going into our third year is, like we've talked about before, this issue has global effects. Pastors are going to be asked about it if they haven't already. Young adults are getting pressed on it. Both, what about Israel? What about Jerusalem? What about Islam? How do I relate to it? And I do think there's nothing like actually kind of coming out of your context, going in that context. Like, oh, I'm going to Israel where Jesus walked, but then you walk in Jerusalem and suddenly the call to prayer is blaring over your head and you're going, what? If you lived in a mostly Western nation, you've never even probably heard it, in most neighborhoods. And you're going, wait a minute. And you're going, yeah, this isn't just an Israel issue. This is large portions of the earth. And wait a minute, I didn't understand this. And then you get in the middle of Israel and you go, wait a minute, this wasn't quite what I was told. And then, like you said, what I love is you meet what I call kind of the untold story, which means you start to encounter the believers that have labored for decades, and they start to, hey, this is what our life is like. This is how the gospel's succeeding. This is how the gospel's under pressure. You begin to see Jew and Palestinian under the bond of the gospel in friendship. You go, wait a minute, there is something happening. For security reasons, sometimes they can't, blast newsletters across the earth. Wait a minute, the gospel is beginning to answer these questions that they've been confronted with, and we're increasingly confronted with. There's just, like you said, there's opinions everywhere in the earth. There's social media posts ad nauseum. There's retweets, but there's very few that have gone and sat there and went, okay, what are we dealing with in global Islam? Wait a minute, what's at stake in Jerusalem? How is the gospel working here? Wait a minute, Israel's an unreached country? Like, millions of Christian tourists go there and we just think this is the Holy Land, but we never go, actually, if you look at the Joshua Project, the Jewish community, the Arab community, they're all unreached. Like, this is a Great Commission issue. Like, there's so many factors you don't touch till you actually come there. And I've seen the last 2 years, people get touched, empowered, and go home, and now they're involved, speaking up for issues. I mean, Europe needs soldiers again to guard synagogues. We've seen a little bit of that in the U.S. They get involved in Muslim evangelism. Wait a minute, we can't just nuke them all. Right. We actually need to preach the gospel to them. And so that's why we think it's so important to come and encounter the center of an issue that's going to affect you for the next few decades.
Yeah. And in the midst of encountering believers, Arab believers, Jewish believers, Messianic Jews, and Arab Christians, some of them converts, some of them not converts, some of them former Muslims, some of them raised Christians, because there are, as we mentioned, different conferences in the land now. It's becoming increasingly popular for, this annual, or is it the biannual Christ at the Checkpoint?
Every 2 years, yeah.
Every 2 years. So you've got folks coming from all over the world to come to these conferences, but as you said, as we've talked about, they are those who are espousing replacement theology. The thing that I love about One King is that all of the speakers, whether it's on the Arab side, obviously on the Jewish side, have a proper biblical perspective with regard to the ongoing calling and election of Israel, as well as a solid prophetic outlook regarding the revival that's coming for the Islamic world. And, just quite often, someone gets a heart for Israel, and then they don't have a heart for the Arab world or for the Muslim world. Likewise, someone gets a heart for the Muslim world. I see it. It's a problem in much of the Christian missionary community. They end up embracing the hatreds of the people they're trying to connect with and identify. And it's one of the quickest ways to connect with somebody is to embrace their hatreds, complain about the things they complain about. And so even Christian missionaries going to the Islamic world end up with this strong anti-Israel stance. And either way, you're hurting people on both sides. And so this is one of the things I love so much, is that all of the folks that I heard, and I heard their heart, and some of them even talked about the process of them wrestling through with the scriptures and coming to a more balanced and accurate biblical perspective. And so I think it's pretty unique what what you've been able to really, you've been the primary guy spearheading this the past couple of years, but it's this is a unique experience, and so I've been blessed to be able to be part of it.
Yeah, and it's like you said, one of the key components is, of course, we put online some of the speakers. You're coming, there'll be it's not just those speakers. What really actually makes the event is, of course, yourself and others speaking into it really adds, a special insight being there in the land. But what's really special is the folks that we can't advertise,
right,
which are those laboring in the land, those laboring throughout the region, who are able to give you insight and clarity and share their stories. That's, in many ways, I appreciate friends like you coming, and it adds a lot, but what really is special is encountering the folks whose stories aren't told, so to speak, online, but really are able to communicate the Lord's heart, open your eyes to what God's doing, because we're thinking global catastrophe, global calamity when we look at the Middle East, but at the same time, there's stuff happening. God's on the move, and we want to get connected to that.
Exactly. So 1 King 2017, the very end of June going into July 2017 in Jerusalem. We'll be advertising it more, making folks aware of it, but this is just a good opportunity to go, to get connected, to meet the folks, and just to get the Lord's heart as we're preparing for the days ahead, all that's going to unfold in the earth.
Yep, you can get all the information. It's 1king2017.com. You can find information, dates, all of that's up there now.
Awesome. All right, well, listen, I think that's about all the time that we have for this week. Listen, friends, I appreciate you being with us as always. Look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.